everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my January wrap-up, first wrap-up of the year. Very exciting. So January was a pretty good reading month for me. I started off the month with 4 rereads all in a row, so it was a good way to start the year with some things that I know I would love. I read 8 books in January, and I did have a couple of DNFs, but I'm not going to count that as a bad thing. So let's get into it. First up, I'm going to start with the HarperCollins books that I am not going to be talking about at the moment.
The HarperCollins strike is actually over now. They have reached an agreement and the workers are going to be going back to work, which is very exciting. But I pre-filmed this video a couple of weeks ago before that happened, so I don't have a clip of me reviewing these books. So these are just going to be included in a later video where I wrap up all of the HarperCollins books that I read and didn't review during the time of the strike.
The 2 HarperCollins titles that I read was a reread of The Two Princesses of Bamar by Gail Carson Levine, and reading Squire, which is a graphic novel by Sarah Alfaji and Nadia Shamas. So those are going to be wrapped up at a later date. Then I had a couple of DNFs. So one of my DNFs was actually The Lost Kingdom of Bamar, which is the prequel to The Two Princesses of Bamar. Then I also DNF'd Furthermore by Tahara Mafi. This is a middle grade that I think was just a little too whimsical for me in a way that wasn't working for me. Whimsy is something that I like the idea of, but often in like publishing, when they talk about something being whimsical, it is a very specific tone that I don't think really works for me most of the time. And so I think this is one of those cases where the whimsical nature of this wasn't a tone that really just sat well with me. There are also elements that I think are often included in these kind of like whimsical middle grades where there's a narrator who kind of breaks the fourth wall, which is something I don't enjoy. And I didn't really feel very engaged in any of the characters or the plot. Granted, I got about 20% into the book, so the plot hadn't really taken off yet, and I could tell that I hadn't quite gotten to that point yet, but I wasn't really engaging with it. I didn't really like the characters that much, which I feel like is kind of weird because I would think that I would have liked the main character. There are definitely characteristics that she has that I feel like I normally would really like, and for some reason I just couldn't get into her as a character. So I don't know, it wasn't working for me. And then I also DNF'd Priestess of the Forest by Ellen Everett Hopman. This is historical fiction, historical fantasy. I think it's historical fiction that is about a priestess who lives in the forest. She's a druid who lives in pre-Christian Ireland. She is a healer who people can come to, which is like all things that I am intrigued by, which is why I wanted to read this. This is also on my TBR for the year of my shelf clear out, so I'm glad that I got to this and made a decision about it. But really it was the writing of in this that really didn't work for me. It was very like clunky and awkward. There was way too much description in it in a way that interrupted the flow of the story, where it would stop and just describe like every inch of the room. She also over describes people. So like when people come to her home to find her as a healer, the author just like describes like, okay, so here's this person, they're this tall, they have this color hair, this color eyes, this is every item of clothing that they're wearing, their hair is done in this way, these are the things that are on their belt. It's just like way too much information, whereas normally a lot of other authors will give you like a general description of the person or kind of their vibe, and then as the story goes on kind of slip in bits of information and be like, oh, and then they like brushed their brown hair out of their face or something, instead of just like listing characteristics the first time you see the character. It was things like that. There were also just like very awkward conversations between characters. There were points when like the way that information was integrated into it was very clunky. So ended up DNFing this. So, which is a little disappointing in that I would have loved to love it because it has a lot of elements I would like, but glad that I made a decision. Okay, so now on to the other books that I read this month. So my first reads of the month were A Psalm for the Wild-Built and A Prayer for the Crown-Shy. These were both rereads. These are the books in the Monk and Robot series by Becky Chambers, which is like hope punk sci-fi. I'm sure you know what these are. I've talked about these before. So these take place in a world that is kind of like a future in which it's like, what if humanity always made the best and kindest, most responsible decisions when it came to society and our relationship to the environment and all of these things. So it's very optimistic in that way. In this, we're following sibling Dex, who is a tea monk, which is kind of like a traveling therapist who gives people tea. And then they have like a midlife, or not a midlife, a quarter life crisis, and decide to just run off to the woods to figure out what is missing in their life, like why they feel kind of discontent. And when they're in the woods, they encounter a robot. This robot named Moscap has come to make contact with humanity, and so it is the first contact between humans and robots in about 200 years, and the two of them become friends and they travel together. And these books, I enjoyed them the first time. I liked them even more the second time around. I really love the conversations that they have in this. It's a little bit philosophical. There's a lot of themes and conversations around work and purpose and worthiness and rest and personhood and religion, and you know, it has a lot of really interesting thematic elements kind of wrapped in this very soft, sweet, and optimistic view of the future. So I loved these even more the second time around. Gave them both 5 stars. I think I gave them both 4 stars the first time I read them, but I bumped them up to 5 on reread. Okay, after that, what did I read? Where's my phone? I don't remember. I listened to Beautiful by Juliet Morelia. It's another reread. This is a fairy tale retelling. It's a retelling of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, but from the perspective of the troll princess, and then kind of continues the story on after, like what happens once the prince has been saved, what happens to the troll princess after that, and she like goes on her own adventure. In this, the main character that we're following, I think her name is Hulga, she is very sheltered, and it's really her mother who has this like scheme to steal away the prince and get him to marry her daughter, and Hulga really has no idea what's going on. She is kept very much in the dark. She is also a very naive character, and so when kind of her world comes crashing down, she has to pivot and kind of decide what is she going to do. And she decides to strike out into the world to find out more about it and more about her people, because her mother was a queen of the trolls, and yet she had little to no contact with other trolls and she really knows nothing about them. So she goes off on this adventure to learn more about the world and about her own people, and she grows and learns a lot along the way, because as I said, she starts out as a very naive character, and as she goes through the story, she retains this very optimistic perspective on the world, but also learns more about the realities of the world. I think that ultimately I had very similar feelings on reread as the first time I read it. I enjoyed it. I liked her character and the growth that she goes through. The like sex talk that she gets from one of her friends is still kind of awkward in the way that it's done, but I guess makes sense for the character. And I still feel like it's a little bit weird that there is it's not a love triangle, it's like a polyamorous relationship that is indicated is going to happen, except that two of the characters are brothers. It's essentially that she is going to marry two brothers. And maybe in troll culture that's not a weird thing, but that always seems weird to me every time I read this book. But overall, I do enjoy it, and I gave the book 4 stars again. Then I read Lost in the Moment and Found by Seanan McGuire. This is the most recent installment in the Wayward Children series, which is a series of novellas that are all portal fantasy. They are following children who find themselves in these different fantasy worlds that are perfectly suited to them. It is these children who feel out of place in this world, and so they find a magical world that is perfect for them, but they ultimately always end up back in this world, and so they go to the Home for Wayward Children, which is all children who have gone to different magical worlds. Every other book in the series is following a storyline that at least partially takes place in the Home for Wayward Children, and then every other book takes place in one of these magical worlds, sometimes following a character that we know from the other books, giving their backstory about the world that they had traveled to. So in this one, we are following a character that we have met in a previous book, who is Antoinette, who is often called Ancy, and she goes to a world for lost things, and it is kind of this like portal nexus, this point that connects to all other magical worlds through various doors, because it is the place where anything that is lost from any of these magical worlds ends up. And so she ends up in this world and finds out that there may be a higher price to the magic than she originally anticipated. This book definitely is heavier than some of the other ones in the series. While many of the characters in other books are kind of escaping difficult things in their lives, this one does deal with the loss of a parent, and then her mother remarrying, and then potential abuse from this from the mother's new husband. However, none of that is like actually happens in the story or on page. It's just kind of indicated that that would happen if she had not run away. So there is also an author's note in this that addresses it, but just wanted to put that out there as a content warning for this. I believe that some of that is based on some of the author's personal experience as well. So with this one, this book is not my favorite in the series. I think one of the things that Seanan McGuire really excels at in most of her books, but especially in this one, is conveying the character's emotions, especially through use of like simile and metaphor. And I think that she always does a really great job at that, but I think that this is one where I particularly noticed it. Just the descriptions of feelings, so that you could really experience like what the character was experiencing. But as far as fantasy worlds, I just didn't like the shop for lost things fantasy world that she was in, and most of the book does take place in that setting, so this one just like didn't work for me as well as some of the other ones in the series. But it's always like Seanan McGuire's books are kind of always pretty good, even the ones that aren't my favorites. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Okay, and then last up, I read The Widow Queen and The Last Crown, so the Bold duology, which I was very excited to read both books in the duology in 1 month, so I completed the whole series. But this is historical fiction that is following a Polish queen throughout her life as she is politically maneuvered and maneuvering herself through different political marriages. This is really like messing up the color in my video because it is blue, and for whatever reason my camera hates blue things and overcorrects for it. Anyways, so this is following Sviatosława starting off the book when her father is maneuvering her into a political marriage, her first political marriage. She then marries again later on. She has this sort of star-crossed lovers relationship with another character as well. And so we're following her throughout her life and all of the politics that she is a part of. And she, as a character, she is called the bold one because she is a very bold character, and she does some kind of cool and badass stuff throughout this. And she is very like clever in her own maneuvering in many instances. So overall, I enjoyed this. I think it was very interesting. I think that there are some elements of it that didn't quite work for me, like the pacing wasn't always great for me. I do kind of wish that it had focused more solely on Sventoshvava's perspective, because that's really what I kind of want out of stories like this. So this is the pitch for this often is like, she's this Polish queen that we know existed, but we don't know that much about her. And so this is sort of reimagining her character and her life, pulling together the little bits and pieces that we do know about her. And so for those kinds of stories, usually what I want out of it is a more close and intimate experience or exploration of this character, and I feel like this didn't really do that. It was more so focused on the political happenings of the time and how she was involved in all of those, and the influence that she had and the ways that she maneuvered throughout it, which was all very interesting, but it didn't have that kind of like intimacy with the character that I was kind of wanting of it. It did follow multiple characters, so we got Sventoshvava was the main character, but we also got like her sister Astrid's perspective. We also got the perspective of some of the other like kings of the time, like Sven Forkbeard, this other character Olav. Honestly, I didn't really care about their characters, and I would have been perfectly happy to learn about their storylines from an outside perspective. So really, most of my caring about the characters was focused just on Sventoshvava. Like, I only really cared about her storyline. I thought her sister Astrid was kind of interesting too, but like, pretty much all other perspectives I didn't really care that much about, especially because most of the other perspectives were really only focused on the like political maneuverings, which were interesting, but again, I don't know if they were delivered in a way that I personally enjoyed. And I think that's part of why, like in the first book especially, I really enjoyed the second half of the book more than the first half, because the first half was really focused on those maneuverings, and it was a lot of just characters talking about it. In the second half, we got more of that, a little bit closer to the characters and more of the kind of understanding the politics and maneuverings through their own eyes and experiences, instead of just this like talking about it kind of perspective. And so the second half I enjoyed more, and is more so the approach to you know, historical fiction and these like political elements that I enjoy. And so I feel like I would have liked it more if more of it had been done in that way, where we of course learn about all of the maneuverings that are happening, but more so like through the lens of a specific character, instead of that kind of like, we're going to have a conversation about this kind of delivery. So overall, I did enjoy this first book, especially I enjoyed it enough to read the second book, which I think I maybe liked a little bit less than the first one, but I am really glad that I enjoyed it, and I overall enjoyed this whole duology. I gave each of them 3.5 stars, but I think that The Widow Queen was a slightly higher 3.5 stars than The Last Crown. They were really like what I was in the mood for at the moment, and I'm still very much in the mood for it. So I enjoyed it enough that I wanted to continue on in a similar vein. So those are all the books that I read in January. Overall, a pretty good month. Also, The Widow Queen was on my list of top 10 books to read in 2023. So I am glad that I finally got to it, and I'm already checking off one of my books from one of my TBRs for the year. I would love to know, how was your reading in January? Did you have a favorite thing that you read in the month? I think my favorite read of the month probably was my reread of A Psalm for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crown Shy. Although I did really love just that The Widow Queen and The Last Crown were like so exactly what I was in the mood for. Even if I only gave them 3.5 stars, there's something so satisfying about reading a book that is like exactly what you want at that moment. But I'd love to know what was your favorite thing that you read in January. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.